In today's video, we're going to be going over a new Shadow Necromancer variant that's been made even stronger with the changes in Season 2 that is good at both bossing and speed farming. And with that, let's quickly go through some of the most significant Season 2 changes, starting with the new unique items, with one of them looking extremely powerful indeed, called X-Files Corroded Signet, which on a lucky hit, your damage over time effects have up to a 50% chance to erupt, dealing some damage. It's actually a pretty high damage amount at the highest level when this drops to nearby enemies, almost like a barber-esque effect. And next, also very notably, if we look at legendary aspects, there's a new Necromancer aspect called the Aspect of the Long Shadow, which on a lucky hit allows your shadow damage over time effects to have a chance to generate essence. And on top of that, damage from your Shadow Blight key passive will always generate 2 essence. So with this aspect, which by the way is part of the season journey, I believe it's just chapter 1, so you get it really soon, you'll be able to use this to sustain the build we're going to be talking about, and of course progress to a more endgame version of it should you decide to stay with it. And as for the new version of the Shadow Blight key passive, which you'll definitely be taking on this build as well, instead of a 10% bonus damage buff to you and your minions while enemies are affected with Shadow Blight, you instead have Shadow Blight gain 100% of your shadow damage over time bonus, thus incentivizing you to take this specific stat on your gear and I believe Paragon board as well. And by the way, even with the crit and vulnerable damage nerfs, you should still see an overall increase in your damage for shadow builds with the new additions such as this one. And for a couple more buffs, if you take a look at the Terror skill, or it's actually a passive on your skill tree, it now applies to all of your shadow damage rather than the Darkness skill damage themselves. So this is kind of a buff to, I believe, just Shadow Blight, which actually does constitute a significant part of our damage, right? Because it itself is not a Darkness skill, but it's just like a triggered passive sort of ability. But anyhow, perhaps more significantly, if we go over to Paragon, we'll see that a lot of these shadow related legendary nodes or glyphs have actually had their scaling change from willpower over to intelligence, thus greatly incentivizing us to, in the case of the glyphs, take intelligence around the glyphs, right? So that's not too huge of a change, but combined with the Wither legendary node being intelligence scaling instead of willpower, that's actually huge because all of the intelligence you're taking from these glyphs will contribute to the Wither legendary, and this legendary node will also incentivize you and make your intelligence scaling that you take on gear even stronger. Switching over to the new Vampiric Powers for Season 2, there are even more buffs to damage over time in general, so not just for the Shadow Necro, but I suppose all damage over time builds. Anyhow, if we look at Flowing Veins, a major Vampiric power, you will deal a whopping 60% increased damage over time to enemies that are moving or affected by a Vampiric Curse. And if you're just doing a dungeon, a lot of times enemies will be moving, but a Vampiric Curse is a new mechanic that is also pretty easy to apply, and itself, I believe, is also a damage over time effect, right? Thus adding yet another source of damage over time to your already really stacked arsenal. So if we take a look at some of the sources for Vampiric Curse though, we'll see that there's actually one called Accursed, where you basically just have a lucky hit chance to inflict Vampiric Curse. But there's also some other ways, such as using Metamorphosis here, which whenever you evade, you turn to bats and become unstoppable, which can be pretty helpful. But more importantly perhaps is that enemies along your path that you evade through will also be inflicted with your Vampiric Curse, thus making your evade sort of a part of your rotation, so to speak. And then one other effect that you can consider also taking is Prey on the Weak here, which allows you to deal 16% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, and allows your Vampiric Curse to also make enemies vulnerable. And even with vulnerable overall as an affix being nerfed, this is a multiplicative effect that you deal against vulnerable enemies, and you also just have higher vulnerable uptime in general, in addition to your corpse tendrils applying it. And if you take a look at the actual build I came up with, we primarily are running Blight, although this is very interchangeable with some other skills, and I'll go through that in just a bit. But this is sort of an Infinimus, which is a very powerful build already in Season 1, and arguably even more powerful in Season 2, variant with Blight. And this is made even more viable in Season 2 with again the aspect of the Long Shadow, which will allow your damage over time effects to allow you to generate a lot more essence, right? And thus making this skill more spammable, especially on bosses, which Infinimus, and the reason I came up with this, Infinimus has traditionally not been the best single target damage build, and thus this sort of makes up with it and allows you to, especially on larger and sort of in moving targets, stack a lot of damage over time effects on them and trigger much more Shadow Blights on them as well. And of course, if you want, you can easily swap between a pure Infinimus build and this one just with a few clicks on your skill tree, and I'll show you exactly how later on. And now for some other skills that I'm taking Decrepify for some survivability, but mainly the lucky hit chance to reduce your cooldown, which will help you keep up more of your uptime on your Blood Mist and your Bone Storm, right? As this sort of is still an Infinimus build. And in addition to that, Corpse Tendrils is great for pulling in enemies, crowd controlling them, sort of grouping them together, and also increasing my DPS with the aspect of the Grasping Veins, which increases my critical strike chance and critical strike damage multiplicatively, and also has vulnerable if you talent into it, right? And then Corpse Explosion is pretty much a no-brainer. I'm running it with Howl from Below, which allows for homing Corpse Explosions, but I suppose on a boss fight this is more optional, because especially if you want to swap out your gloves and you're also using the Black River legendary scythe, if you need another legendary aspect slot, you can use it on your gloves. But anyhow, for some other skills, of course, Corpse Explosion is your main damage over time skill in addition to Blight. You can pretty easily spam both with this build. Naturally, you're also running Blood Mist for invulnerability, which is great for avoiding mechanics in boss fights. And of course, with the aspect of Explosive Mist, you can easily reduce the cooldown on Blood Mist for higher invulnerability uptime, as well as by triggering the cooldown reduction from Decrepify lucky hits, right? So this is sort of the crux of the Infinimus build, except we're not running Reap, although you could if you want, just swap it over easily. But again, for like more DPS with the new Long Shadow aspect, you can pretty comfortably, and of course with high enough lucky hit chance, you can pretty comfortably run Blight instead of Sever, in my opinion. And of course, last but not least, we also have Bone Storm, which is excellent for survivability and also increasing your DPS, because when you talent into it, it gives you a straight up defense and damage bonus with critical strike chance, and also with the aspect of Shielding Storm allows you to generate barrier whenever you damage enemies with Bone Storm. And not only that, but you should also run the aspect of Ultimate Shadow, which turns your damage or Bone Storm damage into yet another source of shadow damage over time, allowing you to benefit from all the aforementioned passes and more, and also trigger even more Shadow Blight. Again, with Blight, I think this is really underrated in my opinion, because by having the aspect of Long Shadow, you can really just spam a ton of Blights and just like stack up a bunch of ticking sources of shadow damage over time, in addition to whatever you already have from your Corpse Explosion, right? Especially in a boss fight or like low mom density area where corpses are not as quick to spawn, right? You don't generate and like ramp up with your corpses as easily on like boss fights, especially at the beginning, which makes this a good way to start off a fight that way. And with that, for an overview of my skills, if I just open up my abilities tab here, switch over. First, I will start with Reap, and you don't actually need to take the third point into here if you're going with primarily Blight, but as you're leveling, I definitely recommend taking Acolyte's Reap for the extra corpse generation, and if you're running Infinimus, you should also take this as well. And then you want to max out Blight, take Supernatural Blight to get an extra multiplier on your damage, it's really strong. You also want to take Hued Flesh for lucky hit chance to generate corpses. And note that this is double against bosses, but I still think that having Blight is beneficial compared to, again, just having Corpse Explosion, right? And then Blood Mist, you want to put a few ranks into this. Take Ghastly Blood Mist. This will allow you to get even more corpses and also detonate them if you have the aspect and reduce the cooldown. For Corpse Explosion, of course, it's Blighted Corpse Explosion for darkness, damage, and damage over time. Here you want to take actually 3 points in a Grim Harvest. I'm actually going to retool some of my points here. I can take out a couple of points from Blood Mist, and put them into Grim Harvest for some extra essence generation, but this can sort of have a give or take depending on how much essence generation you're seeing from the aspect of the long shadow, right? Say for example, if you're still leveling up, maybe your lucky hit chance isn't that great, or you have a lower roll on the aspect, you might need more points in here, right? So it's kind of your preference and playstyle and how smooth and how quickly you think you can spam your blights, right? Or, you know, you can get a feel of that. And then next, you also want to take Death's Embrace for some extra survivability and damage. Of course, Decrepify Curse with Abhorrent Decrepify to reduce cooldowns with. And also, I just want to mention that in Season 2 compared to Season 1, you didn't actually have to have Decrepify on your bar in Season 1, thus allowing for another skill that you can slot in, which is actually pretty huge. I guess quality of life or really powerful way to play the Season 1 Necromancer, which is that you can also have like minions, for example, and run with like a Mendeln Summoner build, which, by the way, on its own is a really powerful single target damage build. But that's sort of also with the bugged interaction with Bone Prison, which was giving you lucky hits to trigger the Mendeln Ring proc, right? So now Mendeln, I'm not sure how good that is, and I'm also not sure which skill I would swap out for Raised Skeleton, but that might require more testing. For example, if you get like a level 900 item power Mendeln Ring, the roll on that I think will be pretty sick, and I think this the single target damage on it will be quite significant as well. But again, that will be more testing, and it's not included in this theory crafting of this specific build. Anyhow, moving on, for this part of the tree, Corpse and Macabre skills, you want to take Corpse Tendrils. I have some items that are contributing to it, I think on my boots. And then you want to take the Plague Corpse Tendrils for Vulnerable. And then here for Darkness skills, you can take like kind of a combination. The most important is to max Gloom and Terror. Here you can take like 1 or 2 points in the Reaper's Pursuit. Movement speed is nice and arguably kind of a weakness of the Necromancer. But for example, I can take a point out and put it into like Blood Mist if I want. I can take out a point from Grim Harvest and also put it into Blood Mist, kind of depending on what I need, right? And then below, you obviously want to max out Bone Storm here for all the aforementioned benefits. And then since we're sacrificing minions, and of course we don't really have space for them on my bar, at least if we're not doing a Mendeln version, you want to take these sacrifice bonuses where whenever you have no minions, you're getting some extra buffs too. And then last but not least, obviously Shadow Blight is really powerful and a key part of this build. Again, you want to stack Shadow damage over time bonus to increase the damage of this proc too. And of course with Blight, Bone Storm, even Blood Mist with an aspect that I'll show you later, Corpse Explosion, you're actually having multiple ways and multiple stacks of damage over time to quickly trigger Shadow Blight. For my Book of the Dead real quick, I have Reaper Skeleton Sacrifice, which is pretty much by far the best choice because it allows you to deal multiplicative shadow damage. But I suppose another sort of choice is the Defenders here for extra resistances if you're just like super weak, I suppose, and just dying constantly. But I think this is probably by far sort of the best choice generally. Next, for mages, I've sacrificed cold mages to deal increased damage to vulnerable enemies. The other ones are just not as good. Overpower is not useful for this build. Maximum Essence is not really useful either, so this is sort of the no-brainer choice here. And then for golems though, I actually am sort of between two different builds, or two different choices. One being Iron Golem, which will allow you to gain critical strike damage. You do have a pretty high crit chance if you use the aspect of Grasping Veins, but that's kind of hard to get a high roll for, at least in my experience. But anyhow, you can either go for Iron Golem, or I actually think Bone Golem with attack speed is not bad either. It allows you to shoot out your blights more quickly, but this will require some, I guess, resource cost reduction on your rings and whatnot. And if you have a high roll, well, you would need a high roll and I suppose high lucky hit chance as well for your aspect of Long Shadows to proc that essence generation for you. Going into my gear really quick, starting with legendary aspects. The primary offensive aspects that you'll want, in addition to Long Shadow, which looks like it's an offensive aspect as opposed to a resource one, meaning that you can in fact have the flexibility to put on any offensive piece, such as your necklace, rings, or weapons or gloves. So in that case, I'd probably put Long Shadow on my necklace for the additional bonus, which I don't have it right here just yet. But if I did have it, I would put it on my necklace for some higher resource generation because it's an offensive aspect. So Long Shadow goes here. The other offensive aspects you definitely want are, again, Grasping Veins and then Decay as well, and then also Blighted. These three are what I would say are the core DPS aspects, so you definitely want to have these mixed across your offhands or rings or gloves, right? But generally for your weapon and your glove, you'll be using Black River and also Howl from Below. Black River was newly buffed in Season 2. This is the old version that you're seeing, but the new version is way better. So you'll likely want to be running with Black River. So with 4 aspects already locked, that doesn't leave any more space for the aspect of Ultimate Shadow, right? Which arguably is also pretty important. So what I would say is, if you're doing specifically boss fights, you can actually swap out your Howl from Below. This is really mainly good for dungeons and speed farming because your corpse explosions will home in on your enemies. For boss fights and more stationary fights, or even like challenging content, you can swap out your Howl from Below for gloves with +4 blight on it, right? To mainly buff up your blight and also allow you to actually use the aspect of Ultimate Shadow, which you would have on your gloves instead of what I'm having on my weapon here, right? Again, instead of a normal weapon here, you would probably be running Black River instead. Or alternatively, if you want, you can still roll with a wand and, you know, use one of the aforementioned offensive aspects if you don't have Black River, right? Another offensive aspect to consider is this one called Blood Soaked. This is mainly just good for speed farming. So if you're just like cruising through, I suppose, like lower tier nightmare dungeons and whatnot, like you want to do easier content, because this actually allows your blood mist to, or allows you to move faster in blood mist, you can also consider this. For defensive aspects and other ones, you mainly do want Explosive Mist to reduce the cooldown on your blood mist and also allow you to trigger corpse explosions more. You also want Shielding Storm since you're running Bone Storm to give you barrier. Disobedience is generally quite good because it gives you additional armor and you can like reach armor cap pretty easily with it. For boots, you can sort of have a couple of options. You can go with Void aspect if you're doing Blight to pull in enemies with it, or you can go with the movement speed aspect, mainly like Ghost Walker. For the affixes though, on offensive pieces, you generally want damage to shadow damage over time enemies, and then Lucky Hit is quite good again for the long shadow procs, and then critical strike chance is great on rings and gloves. For amulets, you want movement speed, cooldown reduction. I'm not sure which passive is the best in terms of damage to get. Last I heard, amplified damage is the best, but any of the shadow passives or like fueled by death is really good too. If you can get any one of those, I would be pretty happy with it, right? Or something like gloom or terror are probably decent as well. And then going over to defensive affixes, you generally just want basically the same as before, except you also want to cap out your resistances, right? So resistances is a new focus of Season 2, so here I definitely don't have them capped, so I would probably want to swap out some stats for that. Resistances I prioritize looking for on boots and helm because these typically roll with fewer other useful defensive affixes, so you can definitely prioritize getting resists on boots and helm. Of course, your jewelry will innately have resistances, and then you can also socket diamonds into them for all res, or you can socket individual resist gems in here for like if you want to focus on a specific resistance. Of course, on your Paragon board, you have other ways to get, you know, all res, so you definitely want to go for those whenever you can as well. For some alternate gear choices, first of all, the Ring of Mendeln hasn't really been tested in Season 2 just yet, so we're not sure whether that's gonna be super viable just yet. I imagine it might be, but you would definitely have to change up your build and free up a slot for minions in that case, right? And I'm not sure which stat you'll be prioritizing if you're running Ring of Mendeln. But perhaps another more possible choice is to go with Lidless Wall. Lidless Wall is great for speed farming, so and it also gives you extra survivability with Shielding Storm. So this could be a fun way to, I suppose, speed through Nightmare Dungeons or even push through Nightmare Dungeons. Then onto Paragon really quick. Again, this might need a bit more testing, and I'll update my build guide link in the description box below when I do sort of finalize this. But currently my setup is basically picking as many glyphs that I can that benefit shadow damage, and there are only like basically a handful that do, right? Starting with Scourge in my first board, which increases your damage to damage or enemies affected by damage over time effects. And then here I also took some nodes to benefit that too. And then for my next board, I took Scent of Death, which is great synergy with corpses, right? Increasing your damage further or giving you damage reduction. For the glyph, I took Control for damage to crowd control enemies, which will be crowd controlling enemies a lot with your tendrils, corpse tendrils. This board will connect to two other boards, the first one being the bone graft board. Of course, we're not using any bone skills, but this is just like a close way to get to another node where I have Exploit. I know that Vulnerable was nerfed, but the additional bonus that you get from this, from damaging vulnerable enemies, is quite strong, especially with so much vulnerable uptime from your Vampiric Curse and also Corpse Tendrils. So I thought it was a pretty decent choice, but it might need a little bit more testing. Here I also have some Resist All, which is nice. And then going back to the board that I'm connecting to here, and you might want to prioritize this one first, because here I have Wither, which, as I mentioned before, was changed and greatly buffed with this patch. You want to, with your intelligence from your gear and Paragon, reach each of the breakpoints that you can with Wither, right? So every 60 intelligence will increase the bonus further. So currently I have 17% chance to deal bonus damage and 98% bonus damage, which is quite powerful indeed. And notice that I have 728 intelligence, which is just above the 720 breakpoint for Wither right now, right? And then I have some other stuff here, damage reduction from shadow damage over time. There's some pretty useful nodes in this board, like this one here, increased shadow damage over time. I need to actually work my way over here as well to get additional really good damage. For my glyph here, I have Darkness, which is just another like shadow damage glyph. This one directly gives you shadow damage for each intelligence that you take on it, so that's kind of nice, but nothing like too groundbreaking. And this glyph I need to still level up more. It's only level 9, so once it gets to 15, the radius will go up and I can take more stuff. Moving on here, my last board here is Flesh Eater. This is also another really powerful one, which is why you probably want to prioritize Wither and then Flesh Eater before going over to Bone Graft right here, right? So taking this board, you have Flesh Eater, really strong passive. Consuming corpses gives you multiplicative 40% damage. For the glyph here, I have Amplify, which increases damage that enemies take that are affected by your curse, right? So you'll frequently be cursing with Decrepify, so you're basically dealing extra damage to them. And then I like this glyph also because of the extra bonuses to magic nodes. And this node happens, or this board happens to have lots of nodes that have damage to elites, so you get additional benefits to that, and also to all res here right now, which is kind of nice. And that is pretty much it for my Season 2 Shadow Necromancer build guide. Let me know what you think in the comment section below, what build you're most excited to try out or are currently playing in Season 2, and with that I will catch you in the next video. Peace.